Und damit freue ich mich, was du alles über uns erzählen wirst. The floor is yours.
Vielen Dank, Dana. Vielen Dank für die Einladung. Thank you very much. Ich freue mich sehr, hier zu sein. Und auch über 20 Jahre her, als ich hier zum ersten Mal drüben war beim Zoll. Und das letzte Mal, wo ich auf Deutsch vorgetragen habe, war auch genau hier, ungefähr 2004 herum. Und deswegen trage ich auf Englisch vor. Und hin und wieder, wenn ich sie wegnicken sehe, spreche ich sie auf Deutsch oder auf Italienisch. Und fangen direkt mal mit einer eminent fachlichen Frage auf Deutsch an. Wer ist denn hier Fußballfan? Ja, auch wenn Sie kein Fußballfan sind, wissen Sie ja, die Europameisterschaft der Männer wird in Deutschland ausgetragen. Und es könnte ein bisschen peinlich werden. Ja. Und jetzt hier die Frage, was unterscheidet das FDZ von der deutschen Fußballnationalmannschaft? Naja, das FDZ ist auf jeden Fall Weltklasse. Okay. Und dann fangen wir doch direkt nochmal an mit einem herzlichen Glückwunsch an Dana und das Team und auch das ganze IAB-Team, auf dem das FDZ aufbaut und diejenigen wie der Stefan Bender, die das wirklich aufgebaut haben. Also vielen Dank, ich habe selber davon profitiert, war von Anfang an mit dabei und es ist wirklich auch für mich emotional, hier sein zu dürfen. Also herzlichen Glückwunsch nochmal zum Geburtstag. Kurz eine Hand noch. And now, let's get started. Let's see. So, it's always the most exciting part, really. Okay. Ich muss dann jedes Mal einatmen, bis 3 zählen und dann. Okay. Weil ich bin ja halb Italiener, deswegen muss ich den Klicker weglegen, damit ich richtig erzählen kann, sozusagen. Warum ist das FDZ Weltklasse? Why is the FDZ, and saying that in English it's always a little difficult. Why is the FDZ world class? Well, certainly the FDZ is giving access to just amazing data. Nowhere else can you get day-to-day employment histories going back 40 years for almost all employees, together with employer data and many survey data sets. It's just fantastic. But on top of it, the FDZ is really a world leader in how fast and effective it gets users access to the data, right? So with 700 projects a year, that's quite impressive. And I view this from my vantage point as Census director at the RDC director at UCLA, where I mostly argue with people because it takes 6 to 12 months, and I'll talk about that, right? So this is not the state here. Data access is fast and efficient. Now, the other reason why the FDZ is really world-class is because it, together with the IAB, it changes the data landscape as the policy landscape changes, right? Data needs are a moving target, and the IAB and the FDZ adjust. And how do they remain dynamic? Well, they have a lot of corporations. Of course, they cooperate internally with top-notch researchers at the IAB, but they have many national and international corporations that help them to stay dynamic. So I think, I'm not going to clap again, but it's truly a world-class data center that, Dana Müller is leading and that you all have built up. And so congratulations also to the FDZ team that's working very hard every day to do that. Now, this would not be an Impulsvortrag if we wouldn't give some impulses. And, I'll come back to that at the end. If you want to stay at the frontier, right, you have to work for it. Right? And so if you have to keep pushing the envelope, right, and I'll have some ideas of how to stay at the frontier at the end. And, there'll be some sneak previews as I go through the talk. Now I'm going to try, I'm going to have a mini history, and a few things have been said, but it's great, and so I'll repeat it. But of course, it's very selective because so many people contributed to the rise of the FDZ that I couldn't possibly do it justice. So the FDZ started small, but not really so small, with a pioneering data set that Stefan Bender put together with a team, and really that's about almost 40 years ago, right? The IAB-Beschäftigtenstichprobe came to life, right? It's a subset of the full sample histories, and then it was 15 to 20 years. Now it's almost 40 years, and it's still its updated version. It's still one of the most popular data sets at the FDZ. And then you've already talked about the Forschungsdaten, die Schalterstelle, right? The remote access to the IAB Betriebspanel. So those were the start of the FTZ. And then, mistake. I snuck myself here into the history. In 2000, I came here to write my dissertation on the Beschäftigtenstatistik, and Stefan Bender really, with my corporation, built up possibly the first matched employer-employee data set based on this data, and it led to the, I think, first top 5 publication on the IAB data, and then there were many others to follow. It was an exciting time. I slept on Stefan Bender's couch and worked on a little desktop that was detached from the world. So it was a different environment. And then I graduated, and I came back, and there was the FTZ, and you had sort of entered modernity with the big banks. It was quite impressive. And of course, as Frau Nahles has said, and Bernd already said, the Hartz reform were a catalyzing event because it led to such an increasing demand in labor data, and then there was funding from the BMAS and also funding from a Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft grant that no other than Bernd got to support the growth of the FTZ. And once the FTZ was established, it didn't wait long to generate 2 of its other most popular data sets, the linked employer-employee data that combines firm-level data with worker-level history. So you have a history of firm and worker data, and the Betriebshistorik panel, the aggregate of the Beschäftigtenstatistik, where you have very long firm histories. And I'll talk about the data in much more detail. 2011, the branches started, and there were several counts. Dana and I settled on 20 branches in 6 countries. There's 6 branches alone in the US, 1 in Canada, 5 branches in Germany, and then in the UK, France, Spain, and Poland. Right? So I'm not aware of any other data center that has that much of an international footprint as the IAB FTZ. So that's fantastic. And I know it's the FTZ of the BA at the IAB. I'll be a little loose here in the way I'll say it. Now, as many data centers are grappling with, not everybody can walk into a physical location to get access to the data, right? And I have a map from Germany that I won't show you, but if you zoom in, there's plenty of places where there's no physical access point. And as Dana reminded me, there are, of course, 4 modes of data access, soon to be 5, hopefully, right? But you can walk in person at the branch or at the FTZ in Nuremberg. You can get a scientific use file that's anonymized either for research or for teaching, right? Or you can send a job and upload it to Joshua, and that was really streamlined in 2015 and is now the most popular submission mode. People like to stay in their office. Some have to stay in their office, right? And they usually get access to data that's more complete in that way, because the data that you receive else in other modes has to be more anonymized. Now, remote job submission is great and very functional. Direct remote access to the data is much better for many reasons. And so given that remote job submission is so popular, I'm really glad that, as Dana tells me, there are already pilots for remote data access happening in Germany. And that's certainly a great direction. Now, you all know that the FTZ is great, but here's some numbers to prove it. Right? So we have 1,500 users per year from 700 projects, and that number has roughly tripled over the last 15 years. And about half of these users come from projects where there's international researchers involved. So the outside research community outside Germany is an important target here. Now, why is the FTZ so popular? And I can tell you, there's a lot of data competition out there, but here you get your data set within weeks if you do it right? And not in the Census Bureau, this takes usually for comparable data 12 months. Okay? Many people have to graduate within that time. So that really matters. And the disclosure review, meaning getting your data, your output reviewed so that it doesn't reveal any sensitive information, takes a few days at the FTZ, and it takes weeks at the Census Bureau. So those people who work with census data structure their life around disclosure review, right? Because they have to go to conferences and so on. Whereas here, this is a very streamlined process. So I didn't know about the 3,500 jobs a month. Otherwise, I would have added this to the sort of the highlights here. But of course, other than efficient data access, which is really crucial, there's also just a great array of data. Currently, there's 25 data sets offered, and only because some have been archived. And so there's actually more data possibly available. And the three most popular ones are based on the core labor data. These are employment histories of workers, firm histories, and then the combination of it. Now, let me talk a bit more about the data. When did my clock start ticking? It's kind of 4:10-ish, a little earlier perhaps. Boom. So the core data of the BA or of the IAB, as I'll say, is labor data. These are the employee histories and firm histories. Now, we know that the labor market sits in the middle, right, and is connected with almost any space of social policy that is relevant, right? And that's why it's such an exciting area to study, right? So clearly, the labor market is directly connected to the BA's own programs, such as unemployment insurance or work sharing. It's connected to labor market policy, such as minimum wages or firing regulations. Right? It's closely connected to the impact of training. And so these green bubbles here, right, of the policy wheels are the more traditional areas where we recognize that the labor market is an important driver. And part of why we are so obsessed about the labor market, of course, is that it matters for well-being and poverty. Now, we are also obsessed about the labor market because it's inherently linked to business cycles and recessions. It's inherently linked to reallocation, to inflation, to innovation, right? And so we have a whole area where employers matter a lot, and you will see that. And then it's increasingly recognized that the labor market is influenced by and strongly influences family outcomes, health, right, and of course, immigration. And one of the success of the FTZ and the IAB is that they have recognized that the labor market itself, right, gives strong impulses to non-labor market policy areas, right? And that at the same time, you need to understand the labor market, you need to bring in data sources from non-labor market areas, right? And so you'll see the policy wheel again, right, for good reasons, because what the IAB and the FTZ has done is it started to fill in these policy areas. Let's dive into a little bit more detail, right? Why is the core labor data of the FTZ so powerful? Well, here you have, for three reasons. Okay? You have detailed day-to-day employment histories of very high quality. So there's a lot of detail on employment and earnings of workers in the Beschäftigtenstatistik. They go back to 1975, so you have an extremely long history, and they cover almost all employees, a bit over 80%, because it excludes Beamte and Studenten. Right? So you have close to the universe of employees. So you have a data set of very detailed day-to-day earnings and employment histories going back 40 years for almost all employees, and then you have employer information, and you have information from various survey data sets. Right? Why do we have survey data? So first of all, it's not a surprise that this core labor data of the FTZ is so popular, right? Because you can't really find such a data set anywhere else. Now, the Beschäftigtenstatistik is a process-generated data set. It is used to run the unemployment insurance system, ALG im Wesentlichen, aber vorher ALH, ALG 2. So it is pretty poor in other characteristics. So you don't know a lot about employers, and you don't know a lot about workers. There's little demographic information, no family information, no information on health, and so on. And so what the IAB and the FTZ have done over time is to run an increasing amount of surveys of both individuals and employers to augment the core labor data and make it more informative. And they make use of the fact that given the core labor data has almost 80% of the employees in Germany, you can, for any meaningful sample of employees, match a survey with the employment and earnings records of the people participating in the survey, both for workers and employers. And that's, of course, leads to very fantastic integrated data sets. The breadth of the data is also important because here you can really study specific groups that you might deeply care about, right? You are interested in the labor force attachment of older women coming from, a certain industry. Well, you will probably need the Beschäftigten statistic to do that because other data sets are too small. But this is just one example. There are plenty of others. And of course, to study the interactions between employees and employers, you need the full data set because otherwise you won't get for every employer the employee. And that is, of course, what researchers are so excited about, right? And that's why it's such a popular data set. So the length, depth, and breadth of the IAB/FTZ data is truly special, right? And that's why people come to use it, right? Now, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, right? On the other hand, it's fun to review, right, how good this data really is. However, of course, data needs are not static. There are events changing what data we want all the time, right? And these events include recessions or the pandemic, right? Or they include policy-oriented changes that I put in green, right? And lead to data needs that I put in red, right? And I don't have time to go through these events, and you might have your own event in mind that really changed what data you would have needed or what data you could access, right? But I'll just point out that there are very visible events, such as immigration, right, or the pandemic. And there are less visible events, such as population aging or female labor force participation. Now, these less visible, slow-moving areas are probably as important, right? And we have to remember that they, too, require adjustments to the data we use. Slowly priming you to what's to come, of course. So part of why I said it, why the IAB and the FTZ have been so successful, because they have reacted to these changing data needs. And how have they done this, right? They were closely attached to research. And of course, the IAB has many internationally recognized scholars that have worked on running new surveys, right? So there's the NEPS, the LPP. I could throw out the acronyms all day, the PAS survey that you all know, right? There's a Migrationsstudie, and there's many firm surveys that are run internally, right? So that allows providing additional data sets as the world is changing. And of course, there's many national and international collaborations. And so these connections to national and international research is a very important asset of the IAB and the FTZ that is really worth maintaining as you're thinking about new modes of data access, for example. The best part was about to come. Here's what happened, right? As a result of these efforts, right? Here I'm showing you the policy wheel filling in, right? We have, of course, the panel of Arbeitsmarkt und Soziale Sicherung, the household survey with an oversample of poorer households to better study SGB. Zwei populations. We have several immigration studies, and we have a range of very exciting employer surveys and a range of surveys on education and training. And these have accumulated over time as there were different policy questions and opportunities arose. And so this has really led to sort of the cornucopia of data offering that are being accessible to the FTZ. I'd like to point out a little white spot here, namely that we have a lot of surveys on special populations, but there doesn't seem to be a survey of the core constituency of ALG, of unemployment insurance, which is, of course, the BA's own main program, right? And that's interesting, and I'll talk about that, right? And you could think about those being on work sharing also as people you might be especially interested in. And you could see a world where you start with surveying your core constituency, and then you add all the other petals of the color wheel. But it's fine. You can also fill in all the other petals as long as you don't forget. Eventually, you think about how to improve your own programs, yeah, and get better advice on the unemployed. Partly here to talk about research, And so I'll have to be brief. The IAB data has truly made a difference to research both nationally and internationally. And I couldn't possibly do justice unless you want to sit with me here till tomorrow morning, right, to talk about all the great research studies that have been done and found homes in really top journals. And so here is my own mini survey of really the top international journals. And there have been very impactful studies on unemployment, as you'll see, right? In a minute, there have been great studies on the minimum wage, on paid family leave, gender inequality, right? There's studies on income inequality, outsourcing, the impact of trade, and of course, immigration. And many, though not all of these studies, actually use the core labor data at the IAB, at the FTZ. And let's see. I don't want to take too much time, but so I'll just put together a few examples from my own research that are, of course, easy for me to talk about, but also because they zoom in on that core constituency of the unemployed that matters at the BA. And since it's getting late and you all want to go to the buffet and have a drink, I'm just going to tell a little story using pictures, okay? And the first study I'll talk about is a study I worked on with Johannes Schmieder and Jörg Heining that was published last year in the American Economic Review. And that study analyzed the long-term effects of job loss during a firm restructuring in Germany. And what you see here, this is sort of the before and after figure of what happens to you if you suddenly lost your job, right? You have a permanent reduction in earnings. And early results of this were picked up by the FAZ, right? Not good news for displaced worker, right? This lasts forever. Now, what we could do here, just with the IAB data, is to show how these earnings losses are larger in recessions. And this increase in losses in recessions are largely explained by the fact that during recessions, worse firms are hiring. Meaning these workers go from good firms to bad firms as they lose their jobs, and they go increasingly to bad firms when the economy is in a recession and there are no jobs. And the preponderance of jobs offers come from bad firms. So that's, of course, bad news for job losers. Now, luckily, there are two important programs to assist job losers. There's unemployment insurance and work sharing. Let's talk first about unemployment insurance. And this is from a paper done joint with Stefan and Johannes Schmieder published in 2012. That, though, was just recently mentioned in the economic report of the president this year. Right? And I'll tell you why. So in Germany, the duration of unemployment benefits rises with age. And there's some reason for that, because older job losers have a harder time finding jobs. Now, in the 1980s and 90s, there were age cutoffs at 42, 44, and 49, where suddenly the total Bezugsdauer, the potential duration, jumped. And what this figure shows you here is the duration of unemployment insurance benefits that people get on average. And first, if you squint, right, that line is going up. So older workers have a harder time finding jobs and take more unemployment benefits. That's what we expect. There's probably no reason, though, why there should be these jumps. And in fact, they don't exist anymore. There are still some of these jumps in the age 50, but German law abolished these discrete jumps in the 40s. However, they were there, and so we were able to use these jumps as little experiments to do a better study, and we could compare people just above and to the left of these jumps to find something that interests U.S. policymakers today. Here's what did we find, right? We found that, of course, if you get more unemployment benefits, you always tend to search for your job a little longer. That's not new. That's possibly what we want. However, we don't search longer in recessions. So there's, if you're worried that this searching longer is some kind of waste as people, start playing the guitar or do something that's not job search, that doesn't go up in recessions. However, what we find that people in recessions tend to stay on unemployment much longer, and so much so that the rate of benefit exhaustions goes up in recession. So we have a measure of need, which is benefit exhaustion, that rises in recessions, but any measure of manipulation or waste stays constant. That means in a meaningful model that probably you should extend benefit durations in recessions. And that's exactly what happens in the US. But since that always happens, there's no way to measure that in US data, because benefit durations always extend when unemployment durations are long. But here we had the perfect experiment that really changed or had an impact in the United States. Now, of course, there's a message here that why is unemployment insurance duration not being extended in Germany, even though people tend to exhaust benefits? And that's not for me to answer, but that will be, here in this case, it would be to say, yes, probably we should extend benefits. But instead, we have work sharing in Germany, which prevents job loss altogether, or that's the goal. And that's, of course, great. Kurzarbeitergeld. Because job losers usually only get a very small fraction of their income back from unemployment insurance. Because they get unemployment insurance when they're jobless, but then they get a lower wage once they're back on their job. So work sharing is a great idea from that point of view. Now, the issue is that even though work sharing has been used in Germany already in the 2008 recession, we don't really have a lot of information of what work sharing does for workers. But Dana tells me that soon that will be different through a match to the Mannheimer und Ims panel, which is great. But today you're going to see a picture from California. And you can see why California, and you'll have to wait just for a few slides. But in this case, this is the only state for which this information is available. In no other state can you do this in the US, but in California you can. And what we did, we compared employment, earnings, and other outcomes of people who went on work sharing with those who went on UI, who lost their job. But there's also another group of people who, like those on work sharing, get their hours reduced, but they apply for UI themselves. They're not part of a work sharing plan. So we compare those who kept working, and some lucky ones are on work sharing because the firm applied for it, some unlucky ones just applied for UI themselves. Okay. And so it's sort of a feature of the US unemployment insurance system that you can work while getting UI benefits, whether you're on work sharing or not. And so we have a control group, and it's a little small, but the ranking is clear. The green ones are the lucky ones who are on work sharing, and they have the highest employment rates. And then the blue ones are the ones who are on partial UI, meaning they receive benefits because their hours were reduced by themselves. And they do okay, but certainly they stay below those on work sharing. And then those who get fully laid off do worse, right? And so this is not an experiment. And we'd love to do an experiment. I'll tell you more about what we're trying to do. But as a first evidence, so to speak, on worker-level outcomes, it seems to be that work sharing does what it's supposed to do. It prevents these dramatic earnings and employment losses. It also keeps workers longer at their firm and longer at their industry. So that's good news for work sharing, and certainly very exciting to see results on Germany, because that's a very common policy. So these were my 3 examples of things you can do with the IAB data, or you will be able to do with the IAB data, right? And I was focusing on unemployment because I think there are several interesting questions on unemployment that are left to answer. And here's my partial list, and that you can add on. Certainly, we know that not every job loser or every unemployed worker takes up UI for reasons we don't quite understand. It's much worse in the US, but it's also, we know that from work done by folks at the IAB. It's also not perfect in Germany. We don't quite understand what the impact is of unemployment insurance benefits, ALG, or workforce services or work sharing on the job outcomes of workers. We don't quite understand the determinants of job search. Why do women, for example, take different jobs and maybe have longer unemployment and then the worst job outcomes, right? We don't really understand who benefits more from certain services, who benefits most from job training, who benefits most from job search assistance, right? And if you know that different people have different needs and respond to different things, we can think of more effective targeting of these services, right? All of these services cost money, right? And then you might think of trying to treat those who most benefit from these services. And then, of course, we all want to know what's happening in the future as the labor market is changing, for example, as AI might be affecting certain occupations more than others. And that's another question we're very interested in. And some of these questions, some of you are working on, we'll see some results tomorrow at the conference. And for other questions, we don't really have the data because we don't have a sufficiently large sample of unemployed workers with a sufficient amount of detail about what they do while they're unemployed and what their background is, what are their constraints and the things that determine their decisions. And so I think there's a real opportunity here to invest into the core data at the FTZ. And why is that exciting? Well, because it may also then lead to better policy advice and better advice to the in-house programs. And I don't say that casually, but with a purpose, because, of course, I told you that part of the success of the IAB and the FTZ was to, this was, no, that's correct. Is because they collaborate with internal and external researchers. But part of the success of evaluation and data-driven policy is there's the demand for policy advice. Now, that's, of course, a two-way street. The better researchers are at giving policy advice and providing evaluation services, the more demand will there be for more evaluation and better data. And that's this sort of relatively basic insight underlies the founding of the California Policy Lab that Bernd mentioned and Dana, so I'm thankful for that. The California Policy Lab is a research institute at UCLA and UC Berkeley. So it's 2 sites, in total about 40 employees. And the goal is to cooperate directly with government agencies, sometimes with the policymakers that sit on top, more often with people who actually run the programs, to understand what their research needs are and how we can help as researchers. And we have 6 research areas that try to span part of the policy wheel, meaning we talk about the labor market, we talk about poverty, we do research on education, on criminal justice, on homelessness, and on health, because that spans an important part of the social policy space. So here's what we do, right? We spent a lot of time sitting down with our clients, so to speak, to try to understand how we as quantitative social science researchers can help. What are the evaluations and data questions that come up in the unemployment insurance system, or in the work sharing program, or in welfare, or in education, you name it. In these various research areas, we build long-term partnerships so that we start understanding each other. And then we decide on research projects, and we obtain and link administrative data. So we do some of the things that we all do, and you do it much better on a bigger scale, I'm sure, right? But we try to do this in California, right? And we try purposefully to break down data silos between different agencies. And if we can, we share this data. And then we do the research. And what's key is we don't just walk away and write a paper. We try to work with the agencies to actually figure out, well, okay, what needs to change, right? And so that's part of that long-term partnership and the whole research cycle, so to speak. And the goal here is to have research be more impactful, right? And get better policy, and at the same time also get better data, because there's a lot of data that's being locked up that can't be used. And once those who own it understand why it's important, right, suddenly things happen. Right? And so that's part of the modus operandi here. And here's just a couple of examples to give you an idea. We're working with the labor agency on an outreach campaign for work sharing. So work sharing is very popular in Germany, Kurzarbeitergeld, but it's not at all popular in the US. But it's a great deal because the federal government pays for it. And so everybody has an incentive to get more firms onto the program, literally. And so there are outreach campaigns, and if you do these campaigns smartly, you can use these almost as an experiment, as some firms get treated by information, others don't, and then you can try to get a causal effect of this program. And this is an ongoing project. We are working actually as formal evaluators of one of the main job search assistance programs in the US that has a targeting component where individuals that come in and that are deemed at high likelihood of exhausting benefits get special treatment. They have to see somebody. Of course, that scares everyone. This targeting process is in California completely outdated. And so we're working to try to do a better job to predict who might need job search assistance. And then we help them to evaluate the program. We are working to assess the effect of unemployment benefits and welfare programs on mortality or in healthcare utilization. Because there is an increasing realization that these different programs help to save money for other programs. They're also good for workers, right? But that's sort of the policy perspective that helps here. And then we have a nice example from homelessness where we went through the entire life cycle where we used integrated data on health, criminal justice, and so on, social welfare, to predict homelessness. And then we worked with the County of Los Angeles to establish a new program and evaluate that with a randomized controlled trial. And did I hear Frau Nahles talk about Zufallsexperimente? I think I did. Feldexperiment. Das lasse ich mal jetzt so zählen. Yeah? So that's, of course, the gold standard if we can persuade our partner to do a real Feldexperiment. Right? And in some cases, we do information treatments because that's just deemed easier. So what we find is that direct conversation with agency partners unlocks data and then allows us to be more useful and at the same time do better research. Right? I think I'm almost done. And let's talk about the future. And thanks to you, right, and German policymakers, the future seems to be coming closer, right, in the sense that there is already a pilot for remote data access running, and I think that's what's happening in the US as well and in many other countries. So getting remote access to researchers is great, and that's why it has a green check mark, so I hope that's, but don't forget your international devoted fan base that contributes, of course. And of course, you know, we'd all love to see more integrated data sets between, you know, pension data, healthcare data, and all these hard things that are difficult to merge. But breaking down data silos is I know that it's happening, but it takes a long time and involves many, many different factors. So, you know, my impulse is to say, well, why don't you think also about investing in your core labor data that has been so popular, right? So maybe that's a great growth area that just you control, right? And I have two suggestions. One is you have the unemployment insurance records. You can build a sample, a survey just on these records. And as you follow them in the Beschäftigtenstatistik, you can also ask them questions, sort of a panel survey of different cohorts of unemployed workers. And that exists in Canada. It's a Canadian out-of-employment panel, but nobody knows about it, right? So you practically would be the first, even though you could piggyback of what the Canadians have done. And the beautiful thing is that you can build it around the questions you want to answer. You can feed online job search activity to it. You can feed, you know, what the employers post into job birds and so on. So that would be a quite powerful project to do better research, give better policy advice, and certainly you'd have I assume you'd have a client and maybe can get on board folks in the BA who are running the unemployment program. And you could think about what to do with work sharing. So that's my one suggestion. And, oh yes, I promised it would come back. You know, the idea here is, of course, to fill in this white spot on the, on the policy wheel, where you said we have such a nice array of surveys that complement the administrative data. You know, don't forget the unemployed. And my second suggestion is maybe easier, maybe harder, depends on your point of view, right? It's been routine that in many countries, including the US, researchers have access to the full data set. And that's, you know, I've already said why that's great, because you can study specific populations that are hard to study otherwise, right? You can do better firm worker integration and so on. I'm sure that's been debated, right? And so, but it's just where I think the train is moving in many other countries. And, you know, I was allowed to put this up, right? Here's a growth of the number of projects at the FTZ. And you see that staggering growth that, and the impressive scale of about 700 projects. And it breaks it down into two lines, one project with international teams and only German projects. And those international users keep coming, but somehow during the pandemic, the German-only team got a little lazy. And there's, of course, many good reasons, right? The pandemic and research focus shifts and so on. But I think that the data competition is out there, and thinking, you know, how to keep pushing the frontier is a great idea. And my suggestion is to start right at home by strengthening the core labor data in these two ways. And with that, I'm going to conclude. And how else can you conclude to say, you know, thank you for a fantastic 20 years and for having established such a wonderful research data center where you can get access to world-class, truly phenomenal data in a really short amount of time. And so I think this deserves one last hand. You know, congratulations, Dana and the FTZ team and the rest of the LG. And that's really it on my end.